The views expressed on the Final Straw Radio do not necessarily reflect those of Asheville FM, Friends of Community Radio, or any of the affiliate radio stations airing the show. Airing first on Asheville FM, WSFM LP 103.3 FM in Asheville, North Carolina, this is The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough. The show will later be archived at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and you can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net. Also, if you're interested in rebroadcasting any episode or segment of the show, you're free to do so. Just send us an email if you end up using any content. If you care to, you can send us letters at The Final Straw, care of Asheville FM, 864 Haywood Road, Asheville, North Carolina, 28806. The show is brought to you by Firestorm Books and Coffee. Located at 610 Haywood Road, Firestorm Books and Coffee is a worker-owned cooperative in Asheville specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog of books and zines, plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. For this week's episode, Burst spoke with Ray Luc Levasseur, longtime activist, Vietnam War vet, revolutionary, and former political prisoner in the U.S. Ray was a reputed founder of the Sam Melville Jonathan Jackson Unit, later known as the United Freedom Front, which conducted sabotage, expropriations, and attacks against profiteers and symbols of American imperialism and oppression abroad. After 9 years of activity in the group and living underground, members of the group were apprehended and became known as the Ohio Seven. Ray was paroled in 2004, about 20 years after his arrest. Here we present half of our interview with Ray, which covers some of his political development. The other portion of this interview will air soon. Now, though, we'll hear about Ray's organizing with prisoners after his own political incarceration for organizing and possession of small portions of marijuana for sale, the organizing of SCAR, Statewide Correctional Alliance for Reform, meeting Tom Manning, the process of going underground and why they chose this route, and the formation of the underground movement, later known as the Sam Melville / Jonathan Jackson Unit. Then Ray speaks about the case of his still incarcerated co-defendants, Jaan Laaman, and in more detail about co-defendant Tom Manning. Tom has been kept off and on in solitary confinement for very long periods of time, has been summarily transferred, has received inadequate medical care for the injuries of incarceration and aging inside of prisons. He was producing artwork until 2010 when he almost lost his leg due to an injury while being held in Florida. He was recently transferred from the medical facility at Butner, North Carolina to USP Hazelton in West Virginia. Tom Manning has only recently been able to start drawing again because he finally received some medical care relieving some of his pain, and there's an art room at Hazelton with some supplies. If you'd like to correspond with Tom, you can write him at Thomas Manning, number 10373-016, USP Hazelton, P.O. Box 2000, Brewston Mills, West Virginia, 26525. Jaan Laaman's birthday is coming up soon on the 21st, so check out our show notes for his address to send him a birthday card. But first, here are some words from anarchist prisoner Shawn Swain.
What you say, what you say, what you say, what? We'll call like a wall.
Charlie Stevens is an English teacher at Tennyson High School in Hayward, California. He recently invited me to correspond with his class. I'd like to share with you my letter to his students. Dear Mr. Stevens' class, my name is Shawn Swain, and I'm writing to you from captivity in Ohio. I'm hoping Mr. Stevens is kind enough to share my letter with all of you. I was sent to prison in 1991 for killing a man in self-defense after he broke into my home. Ohio law says self-defense isn't a crime, but the man I killed had powerful political relatives, and I didn't. So even though I'm not a criminal, and I was provably not in the wrong, I came to prison anyway. Since coming to prison, I have attempted to change the world from here. Friends of mine have a website with my writings posted there. Something I wrote recently received 3,000 views in the first hour. I do a weekly radio segment on the Final Straw radio show, and it's globally syndicated, so I get mail from all over the world. Recently, a book I co-wrote with another prisoner was published. I believe that no matter where you are, no matter what has happened to you, good or bad or really bad, we all have a duty to impact the world. No matter what the obstacles in our way, We have to keep struggling to create the future we want to see. I try to do that from prison, and I encourage you to do that right now from right where you are. We are taught that we inherit this world from the people who came before us. I think this idea is wrong. I think it is better to say that this world is loaned to us by our children, by our grandchildren, and by their children. This world belongs to them, and they let us borrow it for a time, and that means we have to care for it and create of it the world that our children and grandchildren deserve. None of us get a free pass. We each have personal power. If we don't exercise our personal power, if we don't raise our voices to be heard, then our silence makes us accomplices in how the world is. Our silence makes us participants in the injustices and suffering. Can you march into adulthood, working and shopping and dying, without raising your voices against the injustices and suffering in this world? For your sake, I hope not. You might wonder what you can do from a classroom in Hayward, California. Let's consider. Did you know that even though most, if not all of you, are under 18, you can still be executed as an adult? If you're 14 years old, state courts are allowed to say that you think like an adult if you get accused of crimes. And because you think like an adult, the courts can treat you like an adult, put you on trial, and even execute you. In Alabama, a 14-year-old was put in the electric chair. He was too small, so they had to put a book on the chair for him to sit on. Politicians can decide it's okay to kill you like an adult, but when it's time for them to run for office, you're too young to vote. Does that sound fair? You don't have the chance to vote politicians out of office who one day may decide whether to kill you or not. You can be executed because you think like an adult. But where is that test for thinking like an adult if you want driving privileges sooner, or voting rights, or drinking privileges? If the voting age was 14, do you think all of these politicians would continue doing nothing about gun violence while school shooting after school shooting takes more lives? If the voting age was 14, those lawmakers would come to your classroom to find out how to earn your votes. They would find a solution to gun violence or lose their jobs. Who knows? One of you in this classroom might run against them and win. How do you get the voting age lowered to 14? Well, rights are never given. Rights are always taken. So you have to take the power into your own hands if you really want it. We all have personal power. Each of you with personal power can work with others who have their own personal power. That's called collective power. Then you have to realize that adults don't run the schools. You do. Schools are only schools if students show up. If students don't show up, the school is just an abandoned building with lots of desks in it. Since you run the schools and have personal and collective power, what do you think would happen if high school students across the country walked out of school? I don't mean a symbolic 17-minute walkout, which is cool, I guess, but I mean a real walkout, where the students make demands and refuse to go back to class until those demands are met. What if you did that? Do you realize the whole social and economic system of the country would be in your hands? What if you collectively said, for example, we want the voting age lowered to 14 years old, or we want bump stocks and semi-automatic rifle sales banned with background checks for any gun sale anywhere, or we want a school curriculum that is responsive to our real learning needs, one that gives us purpose and empowerment, not one that makes some of us feel alienated and useless, and turns some students into potential shooters. Or we want our teachers to be as valued and well paid as our sports stars. Imagine the radical change you could demand if you could unite high school students in a common agenda and bring on a national strike. Imagine how you could make the world we live in safer, more fair. We would be a little closer to the world our grandchildren deserve for loaning their world to us. Something to think about. The ground you inhabit right now is liberated territory. Defend it. The truth is dangerous. Stay dangerous. Freedom, Shawn. So, anyway, feel free to share this idea with high school students everywhere. This is Shawn Swain from Warren Correctional, Lebanon, Ohio. If you're listening, you are the resistance.
You can write to Shawn Swain at Shawn Swain 243-205, Warren CI, P.O. Box 120, 5787 State Route 63, Lebanon, Ohio, 45036. Updates on his situation and more writings by Shawn can be found at shawnswain.org.
We're speaking with Ray Luc Levasseur, a longtime activist, Vietnam vet, revolutionary, and former political prisoner in the U.S. Ray was a reputed founder of the Sam Melville and Jonathan Jackson Unit, later known as the United Freedom Front, which conducted sabotage, expropriations, and attacks against profiteers and symbols of American imperialism and oppression abroad. After 9 years of activity in the group and living underground, members of the group were apprehended and later became known as the Ohio Seven. Ray was paroled in 2004, about 20 years after his arrest. Ray, thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
Thanks for having me.
Two of your co-defendants from the Ohio 7 case still remain incarcerated, Jaan Laaman and Tom Manning, and you and Tom go back a ways. Can you tell listeners about Tom and your relationship with him?
Well, Tom, I met him in, late 1972, early 1973. We had similar experiences. We had both been in prison at that time, me in Tennessee, him in Massachusetts, both in maximum security prisons, both, experienced and seen a significant amount of violence and brutality. He's a Vietnam vet like me. He grew up in a working class family like me. There was a significant difference in the sense that he's Boston Irish, so he grew up in the South Boston projects and neighborhoods in working class neighborhoods in East Boston. So, growing up in a big city where I grew up in a small mill town. So, in the early 70s, as I alluded to earlier, after I had finished my time in Tennessee prison, I had decided to, as the war in Vietnam wound down, my role in Vietnam Veterans Against the War was diminished, and I drew a connection between the dots again, which is I'm going to do prison work. And I certainly had the motivation to do it after spending time down in Brushy Mountain in the Tennessee State Penitentiary. So myself and some other formerly incarcerated people formed a group called SCAR, S-C-A-R. And we became known as a group of ex-convicts, some family members and friends and supporters who were going to take on the prison issue and corollary issues, criminal justice issues. And just to give you a capsulized look at SCAR, we, for example, we essentially started a unrecognized, but in fact real prisoners union at the Main State Prison, and it was one of our SCAR chapters. And we started a community bail fund program in Portland, Maine. We had some free busing to free rides to prisons and other, so that people could visit their loved ones. There's a large project in Portland, Maine called Bayside and Kennedy Park projects, and we work with welfare moms on a few things, and they wanted us to come down and work with the kids, so we did a free martial arts program in the community building there. We started our own. Before I get to that, we also eventually started a radical bookstore called the Red Star North. That'll figure into the equation here if we want to talk about the time when I go underground and why I went underground. We started a radical bookstore called the Red Star North. Some of us out of SCAR started it. We had a free books to prisons program, very visible in the community and very hated by the police. And we had our own newspaper called Scarred Times, which had our views on the prison system and criminal justice issues and, what was happening at Wounded Knee at that time, and prison strikes and all the rest of it. We were, a fairly radical group. Some of us were Marxists, some of us were anarchists, some of us were whatever. But it came, the paper essentially came off as a fairly radical paper, radical views on the issues. And when all members were required to sell the newspaper, and when we got to the end of one issue before we published the next one, we'd take any extra papers we hadn't sold, we'd go to the projects, to working class neighborhoods, and leave the papers on, paper on every doorstep, this and that. And one day in this neighborhood on the East End, Tom Manning opens his door, and there's a copy of the Scar Times, and as soon as he saw it, he realized, I want to get to know these people. And we had a storefront, which was Scar's headquarters. And so Tom showed up at Scar headquarters, and that's when I met him, and that's when he became involved with Scar in the bookstore, various projects.
Since you brought it up, do you want to talk about why y'all went underground and what that looked like? Because there was a huge corruption case in the local police department, right, that sort of frames the danger that you felt and the actual attacks that happened.
Yeah. Well, getting into late 1974, I was very involved with the bookstore, and we were getting death threats, and police surveillance was really obvious. People were phoning threats into us that they were going to blow us up. We'd get mail with swastikas on it, all this kind of thing. And of course, Scar was still pumping along, and Tom was involved in the bookstore as well. And so late 1974 it's important to be straight up about it. When I came out of prison, I went in a radical and came out a revolutionary. That's the way I've always put it. So, and I had some military experience. And so I saw myself quite possibly eventually going underground. Given the right set of circumstances, and either being presented with the opportunity to do so or creating the opportunity. So I was of a fairly militant mindset in late 1974. But I was, working in the community at the time. And it's important to understand the larger political context. This is Portland, Maine we're talking about. Not, most people don't think of that as a hotbed of radicalism. And the larger context was COINTELPRO, which is an acronym for Counterintelligence Programs FBI. And in late 1974, as I recall, maybe early 1975, the Church Committee hearings were held in the United States Congress exposing COINTELPRO publicly for the first time. And it showed all of the illegal and sometimes violent activities of the FBI and its state and city police agencies that collaborated with it, targeting leftist activists, from the Black Panther Party to the American Indian Movement to the Socialist Workers' Party, right down the line. We didn't need the church. Any of us had been active for a while at that point, didn't need the church committee hearings to tell us that the police with FBI collusion had been involved in the assassination of Fred Hampton and Mark Clark of the Black Panther Party, and involved in violently attacking others. And all of the dirty tricks, they call it, all of the dirty business that targeted leftists, we knew this was going on. We knew the police were behind it. But this was, the COINTELPRO hearings were making it available to a larger public and documenting it at the time. So that's the context in which, in 1974, there's a revelation that the Portland Police Department, this is the city of Portland, where Scar is, where the bookstore is. There are certain renegade officers who have formed a death squad, and the death squad's intention is to eliminate certain ex-convicts, i.e. certain formerly incarcerated people. Well, Scar was the most highest profile, most active group of ex-cons the whole state had ever seen. And, rumors started circulating that perhaps Tom and I were on this list. So then there were public hearings. Well, there were initially hearings that weren't public over these death squad allegations, And we, protested outside City Hall, trying to force them to make them public. Long story short, only one police officer was ever prosecuted for solicitation to murder, although 4 or 5 names came up as being part of this renegade group that actually held meetings. So we considered it a whitewash, and we considered it very dangerous business. That some cops were still out there, and we're still under surveillance. We're still getting harassed. And then the bookstore gets raided by armed Portland police without a warrant. There's no arrest warrant, no search warrant. They came in with their guns, and the first cop through the door is one of the cops who was named as being part of this renegade death squad, but he was not prosecuted. And they come in and they throw shit all over the place, make a mess of everything, search the whole place. They we had an office in the back of the bookstore, and they find an empty can of PBR, and they charged me with public drinking. They handcuffed me, shut the bookstore down, and threw me in jail. Now, if that isn't harassment, I don't know what is. And if it isn't potentially dangerous, I don't know what potential danger looks like. The case was thrown out of court because it was a total fabrication. But at that time, and in that confluence of these things that were going on locally, and in that national context of COINTELPRO, and speaking to various people, having made some contact with a couple people that were underground, that's when I decided to book, as we used to say, or boogie, or to make my move, to sort of disappear myself from the ideas of the government before they disappeared me. And that was the beginning of my almost 10 years living underground and being active the whole time.
I'd like to give a content warning here for a very brief description of sexual assault, which lasts about 15 seconds from now. If you're not in a space to hear that, consider turning down the volume on your headphones or on your radio dial.
Well, to sort of go back to the harassment that y'all were facing, wasn't somebody actually raped at the space by unknown armed gunmen who came in?
Yeah, that was something else that happened, and it was a very violent episode. We slipped up on our security, given the attention we were getting. It was our intention to always have at least 2 people staffing the bookstore. For whatever reason, one of them was late in arriving on the early evening shift. That left one of our sisters there alone. That created an opportunity for somebody to slip in, 2 males that were seen in civilian clothes, slip in through the door, grab her from the counter, drag her into the back office, beat the hell out of her, raped her, grabbed what little money was in the cash at the time, and left. And, our feeling was that if these were not police agents themselves, they were police operatives, or at least were in collusion with the police to do this attack. And it's clear that they had been watching the bookstore. They picked just the right time to come in, lock the door behind them, pull the shade down, and attack. And so, that pushed our paranoia level, or there's a thin line between, caution and paranoia sometimes, depending on the intensity level. So, however you look at it, our adrenaline was shot through the roof because we've been, there's the renegade squad, there's the police raid on the store, there's these constant death threats, there's police surveillance, and now this attack on one of the sisters that worked the bookstore, and as you pointed out, that was part of my thinking when I went underground. And in fact, that sister was attacked, also went underground.
So I guess fast forward about 12 years maybe, and the case is happening, and Tom has been captured. Can you talk about what Tom Manning was convicted of and some of his time that he served in prison?
Well, he's been in prison since April 1985 when he was captured. He was captured, about 6 months after I was. And he was under two major multi-defendant cases with us, including the sedition case. After 2 years in the sedition case, they dismissed the charges against him and Jaan Laaman, and they were removed from the case. But both have been co-defendants in the earlier UFF bombing trial in New York. That was a more narrow case in which the only charges there were the UFF bombings from the early 1990s around apartheid and war crimes in Central America. And they were both convicted of some of the charges. We actually beat most of the charges, but they were convicted of some of the charges, as was I. That's what I did my 20 years on, was charges out of that case. Right now, they're both doing the federal sentence that came out of that case, 53 years. But it was 53 years on a parolable sentence. This is because they were sentenced, this case was before federal parole was abolished in 1987. So they both have parolable cases, and Jaan's coming up for parole later this year. So Tom, right now, that's what the time he's doing is on that federal charge. And he's done over 30 years on it, even though he was eligible for parole after 10. The second case, the second conviction, the other conviction he's got, is from a state case in New Jersey, in which he was involved in a shootout with a state police officer in New Jersey. And that state police officer was killed. And Tom pleaded self-defense in that case. He said that cop tried to kill him, and he had no choice but to defend himself. He was not captured at the scene. No one was. He wasn't captured until, in fact, 3 or 4 years later. And it's important to know, I want to get into all the details of the case, that this police officer, if you look back at some of the media at the time, it's like, it's really distorted coverage. But what was factually established at the trial was that state cop had shot every round out of his pistol. The car that Tom was allegedly in at the time of the incident was shot full of bullets. There was blood in the vehicle, and the cop had what you call a drop gun in his uniform pocket, in addition to his service firearm. And we call it a drop gun because it was an unlicensed smaller caliber firearm. So what is a state cop who has his service weapons with him? What is he doing with an unlicensed small caliber gun in his pocket? Well, it's very convenient if you want to drop it next to a body that you just put on the ground to make it look like, that person had a gun or whatever. And they wouldn't allow it into evidence, but it's a fact that, because the inventory was taken after this cop was killed and that gun was part of it. Anyways, it was self-defense, and self-defense against a police officer is a very, very difficult defense. People who end up on juries have a tendency to give the weight of the police witnesses more credit than virtually any other kind of witness. And so home, was convicted of that. He received a 25, I think it was a 20 or 25 years life sentence, meaning after he does 20 or 25, he's eligible for parole, which is highly unlikely he would get it, but he'd be eligible. But he can't get back to that jurisdiction until he's released from his federal sentence that he's doing now. Every time he's come up for parole on the federal sentence, they deny it. Even though he wouldn't be released to the street, he would be released to a detainer where he would be doing, to the state of New Jersey and that 25 to life sentence. In any case, presumably they're not going to grant him parole to that state sentence, in which case his sentence would conclude in 2020, about another 2 years or so, at which time the jurisdiction will change and he'll be doing that state sentence.
I think I remember reading that Mr. Manning had been deemed a problem prisoner for, I'm sure, any number of reasons, because of the perspective of COs necessarily intertwining with that of police and taking personal umbrage at the fact that a cop died in an interaction. But at one point, wasn't he transferred from one prison to another because he refused to work in the prison industry building or working towards weapon systems for the U.S. military?
Yeah, that was at Marion. He initially started doing his time in the state prison in New Jersey. But because of his political background, and New Jersey does not like to send their prisoners out of state or into the federal system. They like to keep them in New Jersey. But they have made exceptions, and for about 3 prisoners. One is Sundiata Okoli, who was Asada Shakur's co-defendant, Kojo Bamani, who was a BLA prisoner. In other words, 2 political prisoners there, and Tom Manning, a 3rd political prisoner. They sent all 3 into the feds, all 3 in the federal system now, and have been for a long time. When they sent him from the state of New Jersey into the federal system, he was immediately sent to Marion, which at that time, this is before they opened ADX, Administrative Maximum Influence Colorado. Before ADX was online, open for business, Marion was the federal government's highest security prison. It's the prison that had replaced Alcatraz. It was the prison where you're in 22 and a half hours a day in your cell. And they sent me to Marion as soon as my last trial was done. In other words, I was an administrative transfer. I did not get sent for disciplinary reasons. I didn't commit some act where they said, you're a bad boy, you got to go here. They sent me there for what they perceived to be my political associations and beliefs, and that's why they sent Tom there. That's why they sent Oscar Lopez Rivera there. That's why Leonard Peltier was there, Matul Shakur. A majority of political prisoners, especially in the federal system, have ended up at Marion or ADX at one point or another. So at Marion, it's entirely up to the Bureau of Prisons how long you're going to be kept there in a place like that before they gradually loosen the reins on you and you can make your way back to a regular maximum security prison away from solitary confinement. But the problem with Marion's step-out system, a step classification system, in other words, you start at the bottom 23 hours a day in a cell, and by the time you get to the second step, they'll let you out 2 hours a day instead of 1. And then the third step was like you would work half a day as a condition of demonstrating that, you're not a problem anymore and you can be transferred back to a regular prison. In Marion, they made military equipment. they made coaxial cables that were used in tanks and I believe certain types of rockets that were fired by planes. In other words, war material. And this is, when I'm thinking about the time period you're talking about, this is going back around the first Gulf War, talking early 90s, early 1990s. Well, there are political prisoners that, went through that program and ended up somewhere else. But in the 90s, there's some of, I got there in 89. I made it clear right from the beginning, I'm not going to make military equipment as a condition for a transfer out of here. Absolutely not. I'll do non-military work if it's mandated, but I won't do any military stuff. And then, Tom took the same position, and then, also Oscar Lopez Rivera took that position, Matthias Shakur took that position, and at that time, there was, I think, 6 or 7 political prisoners. Yuki Kimura, he took that position. The 6 or 7 of us who were there at the time all refused military work as a condition for our transfer out of solitary confinement. And we held that position until they built ADX in Florence, Colorado, Administrative Maximum, which was even worse than Marion in a lot of ways because the isolation was more severe because, unlike Marion, they had built ADX from the ground up with sensory deprivation and every kind of imaginable isolation in mind architecturally. But the saving grace for some of us at ADX was they also had a step-out program where when you got to the last step, if you were able to advance that far, you had to work half a day. But the work was non-military. And so we had a serious discussion among ourselves about whether we would work or not work, and we arrived at a decision that we would work if it was non-military.
So I've heard other people in prison talk about the ways that they resist how isolation like that actually drives people insane, sometimes through exercise, sometimes through prayer, through meditation. One thing that's notable about Tom Manning while he's been inside is he's produced a good amount of artwork and poetry, including some of which is available through AK Press. Can you talk about his expression from behind bars these days?
Well, yeah, that book was a culmination of primarily his artwork up until then, years of it, a lot of it when he was at U.S. Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. He was there with 2 other accomplished political prisoner artists also, Leonard Peltier and Oscar Lopez Rivera, who both produced very good art. And the art that Tom produced, I mean, we have done several, we've exhibited his art in over the last, 7 or 8 years. We've had some probably 6, 7, 8 art shows, one of which here in Portland, Maine was shut down by the police. They objected to it so much. And which in a way really helped us because it got us a lot of free publicity, because when you start shutting down and removing artwork at a major university, it calls into question, like, who are you going to let define the First Amendment? The police of the United States, or the students and faculty, or the citizens? So and it brought into the front pages of the papers and on the broadcast who is a political prisoner in the United States of America, because that was the underlying theme of the arts exhibiting his art, was this work is by a political prisoner. and he produced this. This is his vision, or part of it. And so all of a sudden, what we couldn't get the media to do on our own, the police helped us do it, because they were classifying him every cop, killer, terrorist, this, that, and the other. And so, all of a sudden we're seeing debated in the editorial pages and the letters to the editor pages is like, oh, is he a political prisoner or is he not? I mean, anytime you can get people in this country to start talking about whether they're a political prisoner and the definition of a political prisoner, you're talking about prisoners in this country, not China or Pakistan or something. That was a plus. But it shows you the extent that the forces of repression will go to subvert any expression by a dissident or a political prisoner or even certain activists that show that reflects their view of humanity. You know what I mean? Because if you look at any police pronouncement about any of us, and a lot of the corporate media coverage, it really is about criminalizing us and demonizing us. And art is a way to reach people that can get through those kind of barriers that have been set up. And that's why they don't want to see that. That's why they've tried to, they were successful in shutting one show down and why they've made noise at others. And so Tom is sort of transcended, the walls, the razor wire, the isolation, the corporate media to show a very fundamental part of who he is and why he's a political prisoner, why he committed his life to people's freedom and to end their suffering. And that's why it was, like I said, there's other political prisoners done the same thing. I don't have that kind of talent for art, but I found sort of a different way through my writing when I was inside. But to bring it up to date, unfortunately, Tom had to temporarily abandon his artwork when back around 2010, when he almost lost his leg to a deadly infection while he was at the U.S. Penitentiary in Coleman, Florida. And it was the medical issues that rose there that has cost him so much, beginning in 2010. I don't know if you want me to get into that, but it's the medical issues going right up into 2017 that have really prevented him from doing any more art. His situation has relatively recently changed when he left the prison hospital and medical center at Butner, North Carolina in August 2017 and was transferred to the U.S. Penitentiary at Hazelton, West Virginia, and he's got medical issues there too, because they weren't all resolved as they should have been at the prison hospital medical facility in Butner, and we're struggling with that now. But he has now begun to start drawing again. I just got word from him just in the last couple of weeks, because they have a small classroom at Hazelton, and he's able to access some artistic materials, to create with. And I mean, his very first drawings, when he was in the New Jersey State Prison, before he had any kind of paint or colored pencils and anything, he was just doing pencil and ink sketches. He worked with whatever he could get his hands on. And when the materials have improved, like they did at Leavenworth, his art improved with it. So he has just gone through a period of 7 years without being able to do art. I mean, because his medical first of all, he's wheelchair bound now, and because he has, we've been advocating for him on these medical issues for the last 7 years. First 3 years at Butner, they kept him in total isolation, away from anybody else. And that was a major thing to deal with. It took us 3 years to get him into a larger unit where he was around other prisoners. And but when you're in the kind of pain that he's had to experience, you're not going to be doing a lot of artwork. And he wasn't also able to get the materials, but more significantly, I mean, he was dealing with major infections, various surgeries. At one, for a while there, he couldn't hold a cup of coffee in his hand. So if you can't hold a paintbrush, if you can't move a canvas, even if you have access to them, you're not going to be creating much art. If you're getting severe migraine headaches, it's been a real struggle. But I was glad to hear that he started at least drawing again recently. And I think he has a friend of mine for a little bit extra money so that he could purchase some paints or some color pencils and stuff from the commissary. And it's through other activists. All the art that you've seen in the book that we put out for Liberty and Love and Liberty, all that great artwork. I've got 3 or 4 of his pieces hanging around me right now. Activists who sent him enough money, doesn't take a lot of money, to be able to put in his account where he could buy paints or watercolors, whatever it took to create the art that he was creating. That's incredibly important. It's not going to free him in the sense that you're going to, the $50 you sent isn't going to get him a bus ticket out of the penitentiary. But it's a major contribution to how he can do that much time under those conditions and create beautiful art. It's an investment in his humanity. Is the difference between simply surviving all those years in isolation and surviving it with your humanity intact. And as we can see from his artwork, he's retained his humanity and he's found an expression for it. In circumstances where, through sensory deprivation, that's what they're trying to do is basically strip down raw your 5 senses. So you don't have enough sense left to write a coherent letter, for Christ's sakes, much less create a great piece of art. So people ask what they can do sometimes, but what a person can do begins with, a lot of times, with some of the easier, simplest tasks. Write a letter, send a book, send a check for $25 to enable this person to buy stamps or artwork or a bottle of aspirin. What they need. Let them know they haven't been forgotten.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So you've mentioned a few ways that people could engage with Tom and try to help alleviate some of the circumstances that he's in. Are there any good information sources to keep up with his transfers or his medical or parole situations?
Well, both, since they're co-defendants, both Tom Manning and Jaan Laaman, there's no defense committee per se, as there has been in the past for Tom Manning. There is an ad hoc group now formed to support Jaan Laaman, and I'm part of it. We'll be going public on that in the near future. As far as information sources, basically we rely on, for both Tom and Jaan, on certain organizations and listservs. So that, as for example, with Tom, we've had done these medical alerts where he has been very sick, where he has not gotten the surgery he was promised he would get, and we've been able to get a lawyer on it, who fortunately was doing it pro bono, meaning they weren't charging us because we didn't have the kind of money to pay our lawyers' fees, and a medical doctor who could review his records and advocate for him. But sometimes beyond what those two can do, and I'm limiting it just to medical issues, health issues, sometimes we put out medical alerts, and we ask people who are on that, who receive that listserv, to write a letter to the prison administration, or even to the Bureau of Prisons in Washington, D.C., or to send an email, or to make a telephone call, or something else. Okay. So with that in mind, like, for information on Tom Manning and Jaan Laaman and other political prisoners, I think that there are several sources that publish background information and will carry these sort of updates to let you know if there's a medical alert with Tom or some other political prisoner. If a certain political prisoner, let's say Herman Bell, formerly of the Black Panther Party, in New York, because we just did an event for him here in Maine, he needs some letters supporting his parole release, or he needs some help with funding to support a parole campaign, that sort of information will get posted, as well as his background about his case and about his history with the parole board, trying to get to parole. So the Jericho movement is a good source. Both their website, which is jerichomovement.org, but in particular their Facebook page, because the Facebook page is updated almost daily. And the Jericho movement has a newsletter that they periodically post on their Facebook page. So it's Jericho Movement Facebook or something like that. And they'll also publish, I've seen, not publish, but post, I believe it's the Anarchist Black Cross Federation that puts out a periodical newsletter, electronic newsletter on political prisoners, and they will update, I don't know if it's twice a month or once a month. So if you go to ABCF, if you Google ABCF, Anarchist Black Cross Federation, you can access their newsletter and background information on political prisoners. And ABC, Anarchist Black Cross, I think out of Denver. Incidentally, in relation to Jericho movement, the Jericho movement is 20 years old. They're having their 20th anniversary gathering, celebration, work session, one day, March 24th, in New York City. And you'll see that information on their site as well. That is going to be in New York on March 24th. I'm going to try and get down as much as I can. I'm going to try to be there on March 24th. But if any of your listeners are in the Northeast, and it's open to the public, and there certainly will be a lot said about political prisoners at that gathering and plans made for the future. A source that I find real valuable is Freedom Archives, which is out of the Bay Area, California. In terms of, they have two listservs. If you Google Freedom Archives, you'll see that they are a very good archival depository on movement information going back decades. And they have two listservs that you can get on for free. One in particular, relevant to what you asked about, keeping in touch about what would be happening with Tom or Jaan or any of the other political prisoners, is they have a political prisoner listserv. So if you go to Freedom Archives, you'll see what they're about. You'll see the information that you can get from them. But you'll be able to sign up for the political prisoner listserv. That is one of the best sources of up-to-date information and timely information that you can get on political prisoners in this country. Whether it's somebody in prison on environmental stuff or animal liberation stuff, or whether it's former Black Panthers who've been in prison 42 years. They try to provide for all of it. And they do it in a timely way. So if there's a medical emergency and we need those calls from people to be made now, that's where you'll see that's where that information will be posted. So Freedom Archives, and you can sign up for the political prisoner listserv. They also have a second listserv called Anti-Imperialist. If anybody's interested, you want to see what's happening from the anti-imperialist perspective on, Haiti or Palestine or wherever, you can get on that second listserv. And the last one I'll mention is forstrugglemag.org. The number 4. strugglemag.org. This is a magazine with a lot of focus on political prisoners, mass incarceration issues, in which Jaan Laaman was the co-founder and co-editor. It was available in paper for quite a few years, and due to expense, they're limited now to online postings. They also try to do timely postings on what's happening with Tom and Jaan, but also other political prisoners. So, for example, I mentioned the parole campaign that is going to happen sometimes this year for Jaan Laaman, who's been in prison 33 years. We're going to be doing a lot of work around that. We're just at a very early stage now, but that information pertaining how somebody can support Jaan's effort to be parole released, we'll be able to find it on For Struggle Mag.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up some really good references there. While you were talking, I signed myself up for the political prisoner news list. I didn't know they did that, but I've been aware of Freedom Archives for a long time, and they produce amazing documentaries. Obviously, archive like digital copies of newsletters and pamphlets and communiques and what have you, but also, CDs that they've put together, video, audio, like montages and stuff.
They're limited by their resources. I mean, they don't have the resources of major archives project at a university, but they do a lot with what they've got to work with. And they continue to take in material, and as they get more assistance, a little bit more funding, they continue to convert, the paper or videotape or audio tape archives into accessible material that people can have access to.
This is the Final Straw Radio out of Asheville, North Carolina, and I'm William Goodenough. As previously stated, stay tuned for the second half of this interview, which will be airing soon. Thanks for listening.